So, what I want to talk about now are just some reasons for agreeing with the identity theory, and then I'll talk about some reasons for being suspicious of the identity theory. So, the reasons for agreeing include the following, and you know, this idea that minds are the same as brains is probably so familiar and kind of a common way of thinking that these reasons might seem almost silly to articulate. But I think it's worth just kind of pointing to some pieces of evidence that are probably part of the reason why people think that it makes sense to think minds are the same as brains. Both kind of everyday people and also neuroscientists and philosophers and people who think about the question. So I'm trying to pick out some reasons that are relatively accessible. It's easy to find papers that kind of make very refined arguments for or against identity theory, but I want to kind of keep the reasons for and against that I summarize here at a relatively easy to understand kind of basic level, to give us a framework for discussion and also just to kind of get us started thinking about this. So one reason to agree with the identity theory is that when humans are in particular kinds of mental states, then particular parts of the brain appear to be active. When they're using language or doing certain language tasks, it's been found that particular parts of the brain, Wernicke's area and Broca's area, are active. And there are a lot of correlations like that it can be found in the experimental literature and are well known to neuroscientists. There aren't always perfect correlations. It's not that everything we can identify as a mental act, there's just one type of brain activity associated with that. Often it's much more complicated than that, and the same brain activity can be correlated to, or the same mental states or mental properties can be correlated to lots of different kinds of brain states. So that's a very common phenomenon too. But there is some degree of correlation in many cases between brain states and mental states. Another reason is that when particular parts of the brain are damaged or lost, there are often particular mental capacities that are lost as well. Again, not always, but regularly enough that we can draw some correlations. There are these things called lesion studies in neuroscience, which are basically studies of the cognitive abilities and behavior of individuals who have some part of their brain damaged in some way. And so this, is then used as ways of making inferences about what that part of the brain does and how it's connected with thinking processes. Another reason to believe the identity theory, another reason in its support, is that normal humans pretty clearly have minds. They're kind of our prototypical or paradigmatic case of something that has a mind. And they clearly also have brains. And you may know this, that the ratio, the sort of what's called the encephalatic or cephalic index, which is the ratio of brain size to body size, is much greater in humans than in basically any other organism, and certainly in organisms that are close to us evolutionarily, like other primates. So we have particularly large brains for our body size. And it's been suggested that that's an indicator that's correlated to obviously our sort of greater range of mental capacities and greater extent of mental capacities in comparison with non-human animals. And so it's worth noting that this correlation between brain size and mental capacity works a lot better across species than it does within species, because and there are limits even there, because obviously whales have much larger brains than humans do, but their bodies are larger also. So it's the cephalic index that's thought to be the indicator. And notice also that men have larger brains than women on average, but there's no suggestion that men, I mean, really, there is no good evidence that men on average are more intelligent or have more thinking ability than women do. So it's more that cephalic index is sort of an indicator of how important the brain is to the activity of an organism, and that works for cross-species comparisons rather than intra-species comparisons. And then a last reason, again, a little bit superficial, but it's that this is a way that people often talk. So they say things like, my brain must not be working today when they're having trouble remembering something or solving a problem. So when they're engaged in a mental activity or they're engaged in a mental activity and they say, my brain is working really hard right now. So they kind of like already assuming that their brains are the thing that's doing the thinking for them when they talk that way. But just the fact that people talk this way lends some support to the idea that this makes sense to think minds are identical to brains. Now, before going further and getting into some of the reasons to be suspicious of the identity theory or to argue against the identity theory, I want to point out a distinction which is sometimes not made by the arguments that are listed here, the reasons for the identity theory. I mean, it's possible to sort of miss this distinction when making arguments of these four types. So in a way, what I'm presenting here is an objection to a lot of these arguments, or at least pointing out a kind of gap in a lot of these arguments. So the distinction is between when two things are correlated, when two things are causally related, such that one of the things causes the other thing to occur, and then finally, when two things are identical. So remember that the identity theory is saying that minds are identical to brains. That means that they are the same thing. That's different from saying that one thing causes the other. For instance, that brains cause our thinking, or that brains cause our mental states to be what they are. And it's also different from saying that when our brain states change, our mental states change as well, which would just be saying that there's correlation and not even necessarily causation. Obviously, these are in a way in increasing levels of commitment. To say that two things are correlated is it's like easier for two things to be correlated than it is for two things to be causally related. And it's easier for two things, I don't know about the last one, if it's easier for two things to be causally related than identical, but they certainly are distinct claims. And with brains and minds, the sort of point of making this distinction is brains and minds might be very strongly correlated. They might even be causally related, such that brain activity can result in changes to mental states and mental properties, and vice versa. And those things might be true, and they might be really well borne out by experimental research without it being the case that minds and brains are identical. They might still be different things and even different kinds of things. So just want to point out that potential gap in some of these arguments.